The political and economic decisions which led to these developments and which exploited the rural and urban masses of Japan were made by the Meiji oligarchy and their supporters. The decision-making powers in this oligarchy were concentrated in a surprisingly small group of men, in all no more than a dozen in number and made up chiefly of the leaders of the four western clans which had led the movement against the shogun in 1867. These leaders came in time to form a formal, if extra-legal group known as the Genro, or Council of Elder Statesmen. Of this group, Robert Reichschauer wrote in 1938, "If these men who have been the real power behind the throne, it became customary for their opinion to be asked, and more important still, to be followed in all matters of great significance to the welfare of the state. No premier was ever appointed except from the recommendation of these men, who became known as Genro. Until 1922, no important domestic legislation, no important foreign treaty escaped their perusal and sanction before it was signed by the emperor. These men, in their time, were the actual rulers of Japan. The importance of this group can be seen from the fact that the Genro had only 8 members, yet the office of Prime Minister was held by a Genro from 1885 to 1916, and the important post of President of the Privy Council was held by a Genro from its creation in 1889 to 1922, except for the years 1890 to 1892 when Count Oki of the Hizen clan held it for Okuma. If we list the 8 Genro with 3 of their close associates, we shall be setting down the chief personnel of Japanese history in the period covered by this chapter. To such a list we might add certain other significant facts, such as the social origins of these men, the dates of their deaths, and their dominant connections with the 2 branches of the defense forces and with the 2 greatest Japanese industrial monopolies. The significance of these connections will appear in a moment. Now we have a table here, the Meiji oligarchy. So we have Choshu, dominated the army and was linked with Mitsui. Satsuma dominated the navy and was linked with Mitsui. Hizen was Progressive Party from 1882 and was linked with Mitsubishi. Tosa was Liberal Party from 1881 and was linked with Mitsubishi. Noble Court, we have Sayonji clan. He was last of the Genro, and he was linked with the company of Sumitomo. Japanese history from 1819 to 1940 is largely a commentary on this table. We have said that the Meiji Restoration of 1868 resulted from an alliance of 4 Western clans and some court nobles against the shogunate, and that this alliance was financed by commercial groups led by Mitsui. The leaders of this movement, who were still alive after 1890, came to form the Genro, the real but unofficial rulers of Japan. As the years passed and the Genro became older and died, their power became weaker, and there arose 2 claimants to succeed them, the militarists and the political parties. In this struggle, the social groups behind the political parties were so diverse and so corrupt that their success was never in the realm of practical politics. In spite of this fact, the struggle between the militarists and the political parties looked fairly even until 1935, not because of any strength or natural ability in the ranks of the latter, but simply because Sayonji, the last of the Genro and the only non-clan member in that select group, did all he could do to delay or to avoid the almost inevitable triumph of the militarists. non-clan. He was of the noble court. These others were clans. All the factors in this struggle and the political events of Japanese history arising from the interplay of these factors go back to their roots in the Genro as it existed before 1900. The political parties and Mitsubishi were built up as Hizen Tosa weapons to combat the Choshu Satsuma domination of the power nexus organized on the civilian military bureaucracy allied with Mitsui. The Army-Navy rivalry, which appeared in 1912 and became acute after 1931, had its roots in an old competition between Choshu and Satsuma within the Genro, while the civilian-military struggle went back to the personal rivalry between Ito and Yamagata before 1900. Yet in spite of these fissures and rivalries, the oligarchy as a whole generally presented a unified front against outside groups such as peasants, workers, intellectuals, or Christians, in Japan itself, or against non-Japanese. From 1882 to 1898, Ito was the dominant figure in the Meiji oligarchy, and the most powerful figure in Japan. As minister of the imperial household, he was charged with the task of drawing up the Constitution of 1889. As president of the Privy Council, he guided the deliberation of the assembly which ratified this constitution, and as first prime minister of the new Japan, he established the foundations on which it would operate. In the process, he enriched the Satsuma Choshu oligarchy so firmly in power that the supporters of Tosa and Hizen began to agitate against the government, seeking to obtain what they regarded as their proper share of the plums of others. So Ito belonged, according to the table, to Choshu, who controlled the army. In order to build up opposition to the government, they organized the first real political parties, the Liberal Party of Itagaki and the Progressive Party of Okuma, in 1882. These parties adopted liberal and popular ideologies from bourgeois Europe, but generally these were not sincerely held or clearly understood. The real aim of these two groups was to make themselves so much of a nuisance to the prevailing oligarchy that they could obtain, as a price for relaxing their tax, a share of the patronage of public offices and of government contracts. Accordingly, the leaders of these parties again and again sold out their party followers in return for these concessions, generally dissolving their parties to recreate them at some later date when their discontent with the prevailing oligarchy had risen once again. As a result, the opposition parties vanished and reappeared, and their leaders moved into and out of public office in accordance with the whims of satisfied or discontented personal ambitions. Just as Mitsui became the greatest industrial monopoly of Japan on the basis of its political connections with the prevalent Satsuma Choshu oligarchy, or Satcho as he writes, so Mitsubishi became Japan's second greatest monopoly on the basis of its political connections with the opposition groups of Tosa Hizen. Indeed, Mitsubishi began its career as the commercial firm of the Tosa clan, and Iwasaki, who had managed it in the latter role, continued to manage it when it blossomed into Mitsubishi. Both of these firms, and a handful of other monopolistic organizations which grew up later, were completely dependent for their profits and growth on political connections. The task of building Japan into a modern industrial power in a single lifetime required enormous capital and stable markets. In a poor country like Japan, coming late into the industrial era, both of these requirements could be obtained from the government, and in no other way. As a result, business enterprise became organized in a very few large monopolistic structures, and these, in spite of their size, never acted as independent powers, even in economic matters, but cooperated in a docile fashion with those who controlled government expenditures and government contracts. Thus they cooperated with the Meiji oligarchy before 1922, with the political party leaders in 1922 to 1932, and with the militarists after 1932. Taken together, these monopolistic industrial and financial organizations were known as zaibatsu. There were 8 important organizations of this kind in the period after World War I, but 3 were so powerful that they dominated the other 5 as well as the whole economic system. These 3 were Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo, controlled by Saionji's relatives. These competed with one another in a half-hearted fashion, but such competition was political rather than economic, and always remained within the rules of a system which they all accepted. In the period 1885 to 1901, during which Ito was premier 4 times, Matsukata twice, and Yamagata twice, it became evident that the oligarchy could not be controlled by the Diet or by the Tosa-Hizen political parties, but could always rule Japan through its control of the emperor, the armed forces, and the civil bureaucracy. This victory was hardly established before a rivalry appeared between Ito, supported by the civil bureaucracy, and Yamagata, supported by the armed services. By 1900, Yamagata won a decisive victory over Ito and formed his second cabinet, 1898 to 1900, from which the Ito group was for the first time completely excluded. During this administration, Yamagata extended the franchise from 500,000 to 1 million voters in order to obtain city support for imposing taxes on rural lands to pay for military expansion. Far more important than this, he established a law that the ministries of the army and the navy must be headed by cabinet posts held by active generals and admirals of the highest rank. This law made civilian rule of Japan impossible thereafter, because no prime minister or member of the cabinet could fill the 2 defense posts unless they made concessions to the armed services. In retaliation for this defeat, Ito made an alliance with the Liberal Party of Itagaki, and took office as prime minister for the 3rd time, 1900 to 1901. So, this Itagaki, let's see, Yamagata. Who is Ito and who is Yamagata? Ito and Yamagata are both Choshu, but Itagaki is Tosa. So he made a contract with Tosa clan, who controlled like these political parties. But he had little freedom of action, since the Minister of War, in accordance with the new law, was Yamagata's man Katsura, and the Minister of the Navy was Admiral Yamamoto. In 1903, Yamagata obtained an imperial rescript, forcing Ito to retire from active political life to the shelter of the Privy Council. Ito did so, leaving the Liberal Party and the leadership of the civilian forces to his protege Saionji. Yamagata had already retired behind the scenes, but still dominated political life through his protege Katsura. The period 1901 to 1913 saw an alternation of Katsura and Saionji governments, in which the former clearly controlled the government, while the latter, through the Liberal Party, won large and meaningless victories at the polls. Both in 1908 and in 1912, Saionji's party won easy victories in general elections held while he was in office, and in both cases Katsura forced him out of office in spite of his majority in the Diet. At this point, Katsura's ruthless use, let's see, does Katsura belong to a clan? Yes, he belongs to Choshu. So Choshu was like the most important. At this point, Katsura's ruthless use of the emperor and the militarists to increase the size and power of the army brought a new factor into Japanese political life by leading to a split with the navy. In 1912, when Sayonji and Katsura had each headed two governments since 1901, the former refused to increase the army by 2 divisions for service in Korea. Katsura at once threw the Sayonji government out of office by having the Minister of War resign. When Sayonji could find no eligible general willing to serve, Katsura formed his third cabinet 1912 to 1913 and created the new divisions. The navy, alienated by the army's high-handed political tactics, tried to keep Katsura out of office in 1912 by refusing to provide an admiral to serve as Minister of the Navy. They were defeated when Katsura produced an imperial rescript from the new Emperor Taisho, 1912 to 1926, ordering them to provide an admiral. The navy retaliated the following year by forming an alliance with the liberals and other anti-Katsura forces on the grounds that his frequent use of imperial intervention on behalf of the lowest parties in politics was an insult to the exalted sanctity of the imperial position. For the first and only time in 1913, an imperial rescript was refused acceptance by the Liberal Party. Katsura had to resign and a new cabinet under Admiral Yamamoto was formed 1913 to 1914. This alliance of the navy, the Satsuma clan, and the Liberal Party so enraged the Choshu clan that the military and civilian wings of that group came together on an anti-Satsuma basis. Satsuma. So Satsuma are like one. They control the army. And Yamamoto was of the clan Satsuma. In 1914 it was revealed that several high admirals had accepted bribes from foreign munitions firms such as German Siemens and British Vickers. Choshu used this as a club to force Yamamoto to resign, but since they could not form a government themselves, they called Okuma out of retirement to form a temporary government completely dependent on them. The old man was given a majority in the Diet by turning the existing Liberal Party majority out of office in a completely corrupt election, providing a majority for a new constitutional Believers Party which Katsura had created in 1913. Okuma was completely dependent on the Choshu oligarchy, which meant on Yamagata, as Ito died in 1909 and Inoue in 1950. He gave them 2 new army divisions and a strong anti-Chinese policy, but was replaced by General Terauchi, a Choshu militarist and favorite of Yamagata, in 1916. To provide this new government with less obviously corrupt party support, a deal was made with the Liberal Party. In return for seats in the Diet, places in the bureaucracy, and Mitsui money, this old Tosa party sold out to Choshu militarism and was provided by the prefectural governors with a satisfying majority in the general election of 1916. Under the Terauchi government, Choshu militarism and Yamagata's personal power reached their culmination. By that time, every high officer in the army owed his position to Yamagata's patronage. His old civilian rivals, like Ito or Inoue, were dead. Of the 4 remaining genro, only Yamagata, aged 81 in 1918, still had his hands on the tiller. Matsukata, aged 84, was a weakling. Okuma, aged 81, was an outsider, and Sayonji, aged 70, was a semi-outsider. The emperor, as a result of the protests of 1913, no longer intervened in political life. The political parties were demoralized and subservient, prepared to sacrifice any principle for a few jobs. The economic organizations, led by the great Zaibatsu, were completely dependent on government subsidies and government contracts. In a word, the controls of the Meiji oligarchy had come almost completely into the hands of one man, Yamagata. It would be difficult to exaggerate the degree of concentration of power in Japan in the period covered by this chapter. In 33 years of cabinet government, there had been 18 cabinets but only 9 different premiers. Of these 9 premiers, only 2, Sayonji and Okuma, were not of Choshu or Satsuma, while 5 were military men. The growing militarization of Japanese life in the period ending in 1918 had ominous implications for the future. Not only did militarists control growing sectors of Japanese life, they had also succeeded in merging loyalty to the emperor and subservience to militarism into a single loyalty which no Japanese could reject without, at the same time, rejecting his country, his family, and his whole tradition. Even more ominous was the growing evidence that Japanese militarism was insanely aggressive and prone to find the solution for internal problems in foreign wars. On 3 occasions in 30 years, against China in 1894 to 1895, against Russia in 1904 to 1905, and against China and Germany 1914 to 1918, Japan had entered upon warlike action for purely aggressive purposes. As a consequence of the first action, Japan acquired Formosa, Taiwan, and the Pescadores, and forced China to recognize the independence of Korea, 1895. The subsequent Japanese penetration of Korea led to a rivalry with Russia, whose Trans-Siberian Railway was encouraging her to compensate for her rebuffs in the Balkans by increasing her pressure in the Far East. In order to isolate the approaching conflict with Russia, Japan signed a treaty with Britain in 1902. By this treaty, each signer could expect support from the other if it became engaged in war with more than one enemy in the Far East. With Russia thus isolated in the area, Japan attacked the Tsar's forces in 1904. These forces were destroyed on land by Japanese armies under the Satsuma General Oyama, while the Russian fleet of 32 vessels coming from Europe was destroyed by the Satsuma Admiral Togo in Tsushima Straits. So Satsuma destroyed Russia. Let's see, Satsuma. But these were, yes, they were very clever people. Satsuma, yes, was destroyed by the Satsuma Admiral Togo in Tsushima Strait. By the Treaty of Portsmouth in America in 1905, Russia renounced her influence in Korea, yielded southern Sakhalin and the lease on Liaotung to Japan, and agreed to a joint renunciation in Manchuria, which was to be evacuated by both powers and restored to China. Korea, which had been made a Japanese protectorate in 1904, was annexed in 1910. The outbreak of war in 1914 provided a great opportunity for Japanese expansion. While all the great powers were busy elsewhere, the Far East was left to Japan. Declaring war on Germany on August 23, 1914, Nipponese troops seized the German holdings on the Shantung Peninsula and the German Pacific Islands north of the equator, Marshall Islands, Marianas, and Carolines. This was followed almost immediately, January 1915, by a presentation of 21 demands on China. These demands at once revealed Japan's aggressive ambitions on the continent of Asia and led to a decisive change in world opinion about Japan, especially in the United States, who wanted to dominate this area itself. As preparation for such demands, Japan had been able to build up a very pro-Japanese feeling in most of the great powers. Formal agreements or notes had been made with these, recognizing in one way or another Japan's special concern with East Asia. In respect to Russia, a series of agreements had established spheres of influence. These gave northern Manchuria and western Inner Mongolia as spheres to Russia, and southern Manchuria with eastern Inner Mongolia as spheres for Japan. A number of diplomatic notes between the United States and Japan had arranged a tacit American acceptance of the Japanese position in Manchuria in return for a Japanese acceptance of the open door or free trade policy in China. The 21 demands broke this agreement with the United States, since they sought to create for Japan a special economic position in China. In combination with the injury inflicted on Japanese pride by the rigid American restrictions on Japanese immigration into the United States, this marked a turning point in Japanese-American feeling from the generally favorable tone which it had possessed before 1915 to the growing unfavorable tone it assumed after 1915. Unfavorable world opinion forced Japan to withdraw the most extreme of her 21 demands, those which were concerned with the use of Japanese advisors in various Chinese administrative functions, but many of the others were accepted by China under pressure of a Japanese ultimatum. The chief of these permitted Japan to arrange with Germany regarding the disposition of the German concessions in China without interference from China itself. Other demands, which were accepted, gave Japan numerous commercial, mining, industrial concessions, mostly in eastern Inner Mongolia and southern Manchuria. Inner Mongolia is the part of Mongolia, southern part, Inner, which belongs to China. Of course, Mongolia by this time, I think, was under the dominance of the Russian Empire. In spite of her growing alienation of world opinion in the years of the First World War, the war brought Japan to a peak of prosperity and power it had not previously attained. The demand for Japanese goods by the belligerent countries resulted in a great industrial boom. The increase in the Japanese fleet and in Japanese territories in the northern Pacific, as well as the withdrawal of her European rivals from the area, gave Japan a naval supremacy there, which was formally accepted by the other naval powers in the Washington Agreements of 1922, and the Japanese advances in northern China made her the preeminent power in East Asian economic and political life. All in all, the successors of the Meiji Restoration of 1868 could look with profound satisfaction on Japan's progress by 1980.